In this video, I want to look at the second half of Hebrews chapter 1. This is verses 5 to 13. And it's kind of like a Bible study on 7 Old Testament passages. Most of them are Psalms. And the most important thing to note is that in each one of these quotations, it says, God says, God says, God says. And essentially, God is speaking to us from these Old Testament passages about Jesus as his son. Yeah, so the first two quotations, you are my son, I've become your father. And the second one is, I will be to him a father, he will be my son. This is Psalm 2 and 2 Samuel chapter 7. And this talks about God's special relationship to Jesus, not just as his son, but also as his chosen king. And this is because in the Old Testament, the kings were called God's sons. And so when God calls Jesus his son, he's not just pointing to him as this divinely appointed king, but also as a human king. He talks about Jesus as humanity. Yeah, so that's the first couple of quotations. The other two talk about angels. Really interesting. It says, let all God's angels worship him. This is Deuteronomy 32:43. By the way, I don't know all these verses by heart. I'm looking at the footnotes. And also the next one is Psalm 104. It says, God makes his angels spirits and his servants flames of fire. And the idea is that all these angels are actually just God's servants, just his mazai. And all his servants are commanded by God to worship Jesus, the Son. And the question at this point that I have is, why is Hebrews suddenly comparing Jesus to angels? Yeah. And essentially what it's doing is it's comparing two modes of revelation in God's word, through angels and through Jesus. And the first is powerful, is angelic and heavenly, can also be quite terrifying and fearful. And we see a lot of this in the Old Testament. But the second one is where God himself is speaking and saying, hey, Jesus is my son. And the point is, even the angels pay attention to God. Even the angels know how to worship Jesus as God's son. And the question is, do we? Do we recognize Jesus as God's son in God's word? Yeah. Okay, we have two more and then one last one. So the next two talk about the eternality of Jesus. And this is Psalm 45. It says, your throne, O God, will last forever and ever. And the next one is Psalm 102. It says, you made the heavens, and the heavens will perish, will fade away, but you will remain. So it talks about the eternality of Jesus. But what's very interesting here is that God called Jesus God. This is Psalm 45. Your throne, O God, will last forever and ever. And verse 10, God says, you, Lord, laid the foundation of the earth. And so here, God is calling us to recognize Jesus, not just as his son, not just as the one who created the world, but he's the one who is eternal, the one who is actually God. And that's quite groundbreaking. Yeah, quite amazing. Actually, God himself calls Jesus God. And so the last quotation comes from Psalm 110. It says, sit at my right hand, God says to Jesus, until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. So Jesus is right now at the right hand of God. And this is kind of like a callback. If you remember in verse 3, it says that Jesus made purification for sins, and then he sits at the right hand of the Majesty. Meaning after Jesus' humiliation and death on the cross, he's exalted to the right hand of God. And so this is a call for us to recognize where Jesus is right now. He's Lord, but also it's a promise. If you don't recognize him today, one day you will. God will make all his enemies his footstool. So pull it all together. God himself is saying all these things to us, that Jesus is his son, but also Jesus is eternally God. And Jesus is the one who deserves all our attention and all our worship today. And the most important thing is that God is saying this to us in his word today.